You're listening to Cereal for Dinner podcast. This is episode 1. I am your host, Ian C., and this is the rise and fall of hair metal. Hello, and welcome to another episode, actually episode labeled number 1. Our last week's episode was episode 0, but this is episode 1 of the Cereal for Dinner podcast. I am really happy you're joining me today, and I really don't care what platform you're joining me on, whether it's Stitcher or iTunes, or you're watching this on YouTube or some other video type platform, wherever this is. I'm glad you've tuned in, and I'm glad you're listening, and I just really want to thank you for listening to this podcast or watching this podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's kind of near and dear to me, and that is music. As I said in the last episode, episode 0, that I know a lot about music, and music was a huge influence on my life, as I'm sure it was on your life. And as you can probably guess, we're going to be talking about a particular kind of music, that kind of music being heavy metal, and particularly a type of heavy metal called glam metal or hair metal. And it was a big influence on me as I was growing up, and it was a big influence on our culture, and it was a big influence on Generation X. And it was one of those things, you know, you either loved it or you hated it or you tolerated it, something along those lines. Let me just say too that this isn't going to be the only time I talk about glam metal or heavy metal or music on this. And I'm not only going to be talking about heavy metal. There are other music styles out there that influenced me and influenced our society, and influenced, you know, our generation and subsequent generations for that matter. But there is a place in my own personal history where heavy metal really played a key role, and going to be talking about the rise and fall of one particular brand of heavy metal, and that is hair metal, because it was so definitional to a lot of the 80s, you know, and even definitional to the backlash of it into the 90s, which I was actually a big part of both of those scenes, believe it or not. I was a big part of the hair metal scene, and then I was a big part of the backlash against the hair metal scene, which we will get to shortly. So, you know, I kind of just wanted to do, also, before I start, sorry, let me just pause one more second and just let you know, this show is not going to be like a walk through the 80s. It's not going to be like, or a walk through the 90s. Or a walk through the aughts. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to start with the early portion and then walk through later portions. I'm going to be talking about things that interest me, and hopefully by extent will interest you as well. And of course, hair metal being one of those things. So this won't be the only time I mention it. And it's not like the next time I'm going to talk about grunge or something like that. You know, like first came hair metal and then came grunge or alternative rock. So it's not going to be in any type of particular sequence. I might talk about grunge, and then I might talk about new wave or something like that, or I might talk about heavy metal, and then I might talk about movies, and then, you know, it's just going to be all things Generation X. So I don't want people to, when I'm doing these first episodes, it's really important to me that you kind of understand the flavor of this podcast, that it's not like this walk through the 80s in music and 90s in music, then walk through it in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in television shows and other genres of entertainment. Just today, one of the first things I wanted to talk about, because again, as I said, now repeating myself, it was so influential on me, and that is hair metal. Well, where to start when you think about hair metal? And I kind of want to look at the origins of hair metal, the rise and popularity of hair metal, why it got so popular, and then the demise of hair metal, like what led to its demise and the takeover from the alternative rock scene. What happened during that time? And of course, there are a couple of bands that you look at kind of before glam metal took off. But you know, you don't want to trace it back too far. I mean, you want to trace it all the way back to Elvis Presley or the Beatles or something like that, which I'm sure you could. But basically, I want to look at the two main roots of what I think gave rise to the hair metal bands, at least as far as the musical influence is concerned. And then I'll talk about the cultural influence in a second. And the two musical influences that I think really gave rise to hair metal were Aerosmith and Van Halen. And I'm not alone in this, but this is my own opinion. I mean, there, and forgive me if there are other bands you're screaming at your mobile listening device or your whatever you're watching this on. Oh, don't you forget Black Sabbath or something like that. There are a lot of bands that you could mention. It's like one of those things, like, I don't want to trace it out too far, otherwise we'll lose our focus. But there was something unique about Aerosmith and something unique about Van Halen that I believe really fed into what you would consider the rise of hair metal, and then the popularity of hair metal, the embracement of hair metal, and then the copycats of hair metal, and then the demise of hair metal. And those two bands would be Aerosmith and Van Halen, as I think I just said that already. Now, why would I say that Aerosmith and Van Halen really laid the foundation for the next generation to move it a little bit forward? Okay, so you had rock, you had 70s rock, you had kind of this glam rock going, but really it kind of peaked in Aerosmith and Van Halen before you see what they brought to the table being pushed forward by bands that came later, namely bands like Motley Crue, Dokken, and Rat, and probably Quiet Riot to some extent. But what was it? Well, I have to say that, number one, it was both their frontmans. Steve Tyler and David Lee Roth are both very eccentric people and very much over the top in their theatrics and their on-stage presence, which again, you can root back into other bands, but these people really kind of stole the show, so to speak, when it comes to performing. Steve Tyler, would come out with the flowy scarves off of his microphone stand, and David Lee Roth would also, come out doing these theatrics and just, really big, showy dance moves, so to speak. And you could kind of hear the less metal, less rock and roll, kind of on the verge of pop rock being thrust into that genre of music now with those two bands. The other thing with Aerosmith and Van Halen is both their guitarists were people who were like just as popular as the front man, just as showy as the front man. So it was no longer just the singer or the song kind of coming together, and then you had the spokes off the wheel of this hub, the song, but you had this real showy front man, and you had this real showy guitarist who were both really brilliant guitarists, and really took a big piece of the pie of their songs for themselves. That's kind of what happened. They took a big piece. So Eddie Van Halen's guitar solos and Perry. Well, look, name's going right out of my head right now. Sorry about that. But the guitarist for Aerosmith, I apologize. It's right on the tip of my tongue, but you know how life is and getting older and all that. But his guitar playing was a little bit more blues based, but still very much up front and very much kind of in the limelight of the song, not a support for the entirety of the song, but a real focal point of the song. for both the frontman and the guitar solo. And that kind of started to define the next generation. One thing that Van Halen had going for it that kind of pushed the narrative on a little further was the fact that they were from Southern California, where a lot of these bands kind of broke out. And they were in Southern California, and they were, how would I say this? They were in Southern California and very much kind of beach life. David Lee Roth kind of had the bleach blonde hair, almost unkept, walking around with the shirt off kind of a thing, which then really influenced the next generation. And of course, the next generation, which would really come out of that LA area, because they were playing, you know, the Whiskey and things like that. They were bands that were playing those things. I would look at as Motley Crue, Dokken, and Rat were kind of like the three main trio. And then I would also put in there Quiet Riot to an extent, because they kind of came from the same area. And they were distinct from other heavy metal, which had some of its same roots, had some of its same influences, but took kind of that pop sound, and not just that pop sound, but that over-the-top theatrics where you're showcasing the singer and you're showcasing the guitarist and really not showcasing the song. They're almost separate entities. And then push that into bands that kind of picked up on that and were different from, say, your Metallicas and even other bands like that kind of got swept into it, which I'd consider some of them just rock and roll bands like Bon Jovi, but they kind of got swept into it. They were kind of on the edge and got swept into some of this. Certainly Quiet Riot did a little bit as well. But I would say they were at least, 2 feet in, one arm out kind of a thing. And we can talk about why, but certainly people who are squarely in the middle, foundational to this movement would have been Motley Crue, Dokken, and Rat. And they were foundational because of the sound that they had, the types of songs that they wrote, and the look that they had. The look was very similar. So they took the next step in that kind of David Lee Roth kind of thing and took the next step in developing their look. Let me see here. There's a few places here I wanna pause and make sure I'm getting everything in that I want to say. One of the things that I want to say is that when you look at these bands, well, let me just say this too. The other thing that happened that kind of fed into this, and why they took the look of David Lee Roth and the look of Steven Tyler and blew that up or pushed that forward, had to do with the fact of the rise of MTV as well. Because now no longer are you just listening to the music, but you have to have a video that goes along with it. And these guys were really good at producing videos, which was interesting because a few years prior to that, the songs that were really so prior to this, the songs that were big on MTV were not rock songs. They were synth pop songs, and they were songs, they were new wave. It was the new wave and the reason why is because new wave had better videos. And so when MTV came out, new wave had better videos. But now you started to getting these rock bands playing these new wave videos as well. And one of the things that they did on to playing these new wave videos or playing these, getting big on MTV was the showiness, which really fed into their genre of music, was their showiness. And so they became show bands. And so then the hair got big and the clothes got loud and everything was just about the show. Everything was really about how good you looked Okay, now that was the look. That was the look, and the sound started developing. The other thing that kind of made these bands what they were was the substance of their music. What was their music about? And it was very hedonistic type of music. It was not your Epicurean, reserved hedonism either. It was this crass, over-the-top hedonism that that people wanted to emulate, where you are the guy who scores with the most chicks, and you are the person who is the best at what you do. You're the winner. And a lot of that kind of fed into the type of music that they play. A lot of their music was about having a good time, about drinking, about drugs, about scoring with women. It was all about that. And then that started to get pushed along even further as these bands developed, which is interesting to me because when you look at, say, I would say one of the foundational bands in this genre was Motley Crue. And Motley Crue really kind of started off as a little bit kind of pop, a little bit kind of heavy metal, but then on their first album, Too Fast for Love, but on their second album, it was really kind of had a dark flavor to it. It was really dark, but it was still showy. It was still real kind of showy, but it was dark. Shout at the Devil. I mean, it was kind of had that dark, almost, influenced by Black Sabbath kind of a thing, where then their Theater of Pain became very showy, very much, not looking dark, not wearing the dark leather and the dark makeup, but now wearing bright makeup, pink and lipstick and things like that came out when Theater of Pain came out. And I really see Theater of Pain as kind of this, I think it came out in like 1986, around there, maybe 1987, not later than that, but I think 1986 is when Theater of Pain came out. And that really kind of turned the corner to a tipping point of now we're in glam. Now we're not just kind of heavy metal with the lighter side, heavy metal having a good time, heavy metal singing about drugs and girls and playing the guitar solos, but now we're heavy metal about excess and about, to a degree, crossing gender lines. Now you're heavy metal kind of looking like a girl, the front man wearing makeup, not just makeup like Kiss, but makeup like a girl wears makeup. And well, as you know, that the MTV executives found that this type of music was getting so popular that they even opened up their own 3-hour block of TV called the Headbangers Ball. And the Headbangers Ball then allowed a lot more bands to kind of be exposed as well, and bands that were not quite glam, but heavy metal was in rotation, was on there, and well, heavy metal was on there, but I'm talking glam metal. Sorry, I say those two things interchangeably sometimes, and I really shouldn't. Glam metal or hair metal is a particular type of heavy metal. And so let me just kind of summarize here before I go into the next topic of the heyday of it, and then the final topic, the demise of it. The bands that really kind of influence had the same themes in their music, which was very hedonistic. They had, to a degree, the same look, which was kind of like, I don't know, like scary. I hate saying this because I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm just going to say what I think, and that's kind of scary metal light, and then pushed that into almost dressing like a girl to some extent. The makeup became more feminine and less dark, less like Kiss and more pink and things like that. Although you did have Twisted Sister kind of doing that a little bit earlier, but it certainly fed into it. You certainly saw this growth of it. And then everything kind of being pieced out as far as the music was concerned, rather than being the song being the main thing, the singer is the main thing, and the guitarist is the main thing, and how good the guitarist is and how good the singer is kind of being the main thing. Well, after you had the foundational bands that kind of developed this sound, then you had bands that I wouldn't say copied it, but embraced it, okay? They embraced it. They came along and said, we're doing this and we're going to turn it up to 11. And I would say probably, there were a lot of bands that came out during that time. Some of them got some popularity and some of them got a lot of popularity. And the bands that got probably the most popularity, let me just mention two right off the bat, and that was Warrant and Poison. Warrant and Poison took that to the next extreme. Okay. Also, something that happened with Motley Crue, and that kind of, I think, to a degree influenced, and again, I want to say influence, not copy. Okay, influence, not copy. I don't believe Warrant and Poison were copying these bands. Now, you get copycats later. Okay, you get really bad copycats later. But these are just, as I see it, people who embraced it and were already having these same ideas, influenced, and then took it a step further. But one thing that kind of also came out too was Home Sweet Home, which was, the 1986 release, if I'm right about that date, with Motley Crue. And then came the power ballad. Then you started getting this explosion of these bands. And what was interesting is you also had, so you had the power ballad, which will feed into this, but you had such popularity of these bands that you even found bands that weren't really that genre kind of trying to reboot their career to fit that genre. I would say, so even Ozzy Osbourne in The Ultimate Sin, his second album with Jakey Lee, you can really see the glam side coming out. And Jakey Lee being an absolute brilliant guitarist, but really more in the line of that over the top, I'm not just a good guitarist supporting the song, I'm showcasing my guitar skills. And you get that to some degree with Randy Rhoads as well. But then you kind of get the makeup, and then the very cool video. The Ultimate Sin was, kind of a parody of Dallas at the time. And so you got older bands that that were heavy metal but weren't necessarily metal. That were heavy metal but not necessarily hair metal, kind of rebooting a little bit to become hair metal. That also happened with Whitesnake, which was just kind of a rock and roll band, but in the late 80s they became this kind of over the top, eccentric hair metal kind of band, hair rock band. And also, unfortunately, Judas Priest put out Turbo Lover, and they also tried to do kind of a glam metal kind of sound, I think. I don't know. I'm just giving you what my opinion was on it. Now, I was introduced to heavy metal at the age of 12 years old. I had a friend who actually was blind, and he was a guitarist, and he was one of the best guitarists that I'd ever met. Actually, probably one of the best guitarists that ever was. Unfortunately, he passed away a number of years ago now, but He was a really good guitarist, and he he introduced me to heavy metal. And the first heavy metal band that I ever listened to was not glam metal at all. It was actually Iron Maiden, and it was Iron Maiden's live album. And he, for some reason, he had an extra copy of it, and he loaned it to me, and I listened to it. And then I had another friend who was really into Motley Crue. And this was a little bit before Motley Crue went glam. This was just maybe right at that time. And so, heavy metal was kind of an influence on me as well. And this is important to my story because it will show you why I was into glam metal and then also not into glam metal. Okay, and I'll just share that with you here as we kind of go along. One of the reasons I was really into glam metal is because it appealed to me as a young male. And I was about, I was 12 when I first listened to my first heavy metal album ever. I'd listened to Van Halen was on the radio before, but I wasn't like, oh, that's heavy metal. I didn't know these genres of music. I just thought that was a good song. Jump's an awesome song. But when I really started to come into my own kind of teenage years where you kind of define yourself, I definitely defined it in light of Motley Crue for the most part. I even grew my hair out long and dyed it blonde, and I wanted to be the next Vince Neil. And, I was really into guitar, and I was really into singing, and, we wanted to, it never really went anywhere, but I really wanted to be the next Vince Neil. And what appealed to me too was the ethos of the music. It was really I would guess what I would say, what really appealed to me was the manliness of the music, kind of, because that's what it was about. As I previously mentioned, it was about like, you're the conqueror of the world and all these girls like you. That was the persona I wanted to put out. Now, that wasn't my reality. My reality was actually just quite the opposite. My reality is that I was a picked on kid, and I had much more in common with a Kurt Cobain than I did a Vince Neil. But I didn't want to admit it, especially being a teenager. I wanted to be that guy who all the women swooned for and everybody liked. I really wanted to be that person. And so I played that up and, ripped my jeans and stonewashed my jeans and wore the concert t-shirt with the denim jacket and the bandana turned around the other way. Up until I was actually probably around 17. And personally speaking, and I'll probably talk about this more when I talk about, all the alternative rock music. I liked that music, but I also liked a lot of other kind of music. And when my friends found out that I turned to alternative rock, they're like, that's not a surprise, because I was also really, at the same time, I was really into some obscure bands that were rock but weren't like hair metal or even heavy metal. I was into like NXS like quite a bit. I really, really liked NXS. And so my friends who were all into heavy metal would be like, oh, I'd turn on an NXS song and they'd be like, well, that's a little weird, dude. Why do you like NXS? I also really liked a couple of obscure rock bands like Bang Tango and DAD and things like that a lot of people hadn't heard of. But I was like really into them. I thought these were really good bands. But I was also very much into hair metal. It's just kind of funny because when I kind of converted to alternative rock, a lot of my friends said, that makes sense. And really, it really had to do with my emotions, because I wanted to be the Vince Neil, but I really wasn't. I wanted to be the Jakey Lee, the Van Halen on the guitar, but I absolutely sucked. I could play chords and I could write good music, but I absolutely sucked at being a lead guitarist. And so I really actually had more in common with what people in alternative rock were going through, and it really resonated with me when the scene finally broke. I was into like the Cult too. I really, really enjoyed the Cult when it came out, when they came out. But anyway, okay, so you had the heyday, you had the people who embraced it. I'm forgetting all the names of the bands that weren't copycats but just embraced it. But I really think that it kind of came out in Warrant and Poison were kind of the two main bands that just like, we're glam metal and we are not ashamed. It's not a development. Here we are. We are glam over the top metal. Well, what started to unravel all this? Why was there such a shift in music from this type of music, heavy metal in general, glam metal in particular, to the alternative rock scene? There were a few underpinning things that happened, and I don't have time to go through all of them. But number one, let me say, we talked a little bit about the power ballad. The power ballads were cool, but they were expected, and they seemed to a degree to be artificial by some genres of music, by some bands, I should say. They just seemed to be artificial. Like, give us your ballad so we can sell more. Some of them were really good, like Home Sweet Home was a really good song. And I thought Every Rose Has Its Thorn was a really good song. But I'm not going to be too critical, but there were some bands that were putting out ballads that was just like, yeah, okay, I don't feel it. I feel like this is fake, this is put together. So the power ballad really kind of became its biggest rise to top because so many people were listening to it, but it also kind of became its demise as well because it just kind of got overplayed. It's just like all these bands kind of become power ballad bands, and there really is no metal or kick butt mindset of heavy metal involved in this at all. The other thing that happened is it just became flooded. The industry became just flooded with a bunch of bands that I would consider to be copycat bands. Okay? Absolute just copycat bands. I hate to name names, but let me just say some bands that came out that I really just was like, really? I mean, I really didn't like some of the, well, I'll refrain from that. I want to be positive, but there were bands that were just copycat bands, and they really started to flood the industry, which was driven by money, because they wanted the next Motley Crue, they wanted the next Poison. So you back several bands that kind of look the same, sound the same, in hopes that one of them will be multi-platinum. So that kind of became its own parody of itself. Like, here's another guy who looks like a girl, who sings like a girl, and he can sing higher. The other thing is the songs themselves started to become more and more about the individuals in the band and less about the songs. And while that was a feature of what made it what it is, it also unraveled it, in my opinion. So the song wasn't really about the song, it was about how high the singer could sing. Could he hit those high notes? And it's just like, yeah, but your songs aren't good. So, yeah, but our singer can hit the high notes, man. Can you hear his, when he do these octave runs and things like that? And the guitarist, look how fast he is. Look how fast he can play the guitar. And so it's like, yeah, but the song's not good. Yeah, but do you see how fast this guy can play the guitar? How good of a guitarist he is? How much he can shred the guitar? So the songs kind of became less about the entirety and more about the pieces. And drummers got into this to some extent, and some extent bassists, but for the most part it was the lead singer and the lead guitarist and how much they could shred. And so the songs suffered themselves, and they became just more about the individual pieces and less about coming together to create a good song. And then, it's like eating too much candy. You can only do the sex, drugs, and rock and roll for so long before you burn yourself out, before you realize there's really no substance. And it didn't appeal to the next generation of kids, including myself, who were hurting, who who were broken, who came from broken homes, who were going through divorces, who didn't know where they fit in the world. Because in heavy metal, you're supposed to know where you fit, man. You're the god of 10 planets, and you are supposed to know where you fit. And for a lot of us, and this is why alternative rock rang so true to me, was I didn't know where I fit. I didn't have an idea of who I really was. Everything that I had an idea of who I was really a facade. And so I didn't know who I was. And then you had the advent of bands that kind of were less glam, more substantive, some heavy metal, and some kind of one foot in heavy metal, and some not. So then you had the rise of this music too that came about, which I think put an end to it. But the other thing was kind of burning out on its own. It's trying to, like you're just trying to live off candy all your life. You're not going to have any good nutrition. You're going to die because all it is candy. And then you had the rise of substantive rock, where people were really connecting with the deeper emotional issues that kids were going through. So for example, you had probably one of the bands that turned a corner in all this was Guns N' Roses. And while at the very beginning kind of Guns N' Roses did the hair thing, the Axl Rose and Welcome to the Jungle kind of did the hair thing. And this was, I recall, 87, 88. I mean, this just went boom. I mean, we're talking about bands coming out and the rise, and really it was so over. And the first generation and second generation, within a year, third generation within a year of these bands kind of turning over. Guns N' Roses came out, and Guns N' Roses was considered, the term that I heard it was called was sleaze metal. And sleaze metal was kind of like, it's still heavy metal. It's still, very much featured on the vocals and the guitars, but there's more emphasis put into the songs. Way less glam. They looked dirty, kind of pre-grungy looking. Skid Row kind of fell into this a little bit too, although Sebastian Bach was very much into I would say he's probably the most glam of what Skid Row was. I would say, Rachel Bolan, and they almost had kind of a punk ethos to them. So Skid Row is kind of half and half. Guns N' Roses, I think if there was no such thing as glam metal, I'm not even sure we would have considered them even in that genre at all, or we would be talking about them in the same breath. Talking more about dark issues, things like drug abuse, and things like that. And then you started getting the more and more rise in popularity of underground music coming to the top and this isn't about the rise of that music, so I'm going to keep my comments brief on this, but then you had the band that kind of broke the scene, which was moving underneath anyway, was Nirvana, of course. And they kind of broke what was kind of already building up. And a new music genre took over. And what's interesting about this is music has always changed. And I'll leave on this note here. I'll leave on this note because I'm getting long-winded. But music has always changed. The music of the 60s doesn't sound like the music of the 70s, which doesn't sound like the music of the 80s, especially in rock. It's changed. But there wasn't this as sharp of an evolution between the death of hair metal and the rise of alternative rock as there was previously. It kind of seemed to change organically. And while this was organic, it was just this explosion. And it was a rejection, too, of the previous generation. Where before, like if you're in an old 70s rock band and you're looking at some 80s, you might not like it. But people in the 80s weren't going, people in the 80s, in these bands weren't going, oh, you guys sucked and I hate what you did and it was terrible music and now we're the new torch of the generation. But you did get that in the 90s, and I was kind of part of that too. They looked back at hair metal and basically said, you guys suck. we don't like you. We don't like what you stand for. We don't like anything. There was this sharp turn of events that hadn't been seen previously in rock music. Rock music was more of this slow evolution, and well, I mean, to some degree slow. I mean, it would change over time fairly rapidly, but not to the extent that you had one type of music just die and then another type of music come alive and actually point their finger in shame almost at these previous generation. Well, let me just say one last thing before I still, I went through this thing for a while where I hated heavy metal because I was all into alternative rock, and alternative rock is still my main staple, which as you listen to the show, you'll get to know more about me personally. It's still, alternative rock is still my main staple. But as I look back now, there are some bands back there that I really, even foundational bands that I really like. And let me just say, probably the band back at that era that came out that you could say was a glam rock band that I really still do enjoy, that I think was probably, sorry to anybody else, but I'm not saying anybody else was bad. I'm just saying this was the band that, as I listen to them now, I find a lot of value in their music, being a heavy metal glam band, and that's Dokken. I really think there was some substantive stuff with Dokken, at least much more than the other bands. Not to say that I don't listen to those other bands, not to say I hate those other bands, not to say those other bands don't have good music. One of my favorite songs is Kickstart Your Heart. I listen to that when I work out all the time. You put that on and you've got to run. I listen to a lot of heavy metal when I'm working out, but my main focus on music is alternative. And what's interesting is glam metal didn't have any children. It's all retro. Where you look at somebody like Nirvana, I still find kids wearing Nirvana shirts. I still find millennials and Generation Z wearing Nirvana shirts. Where the people wearing a Winger shirt today are, either you got it as a hand-me-down, or they're old guys that are reliving their past. So they really didn't have any children. They just kind of only lived through nostalgia. And where bands like alternative rock bands and even punk rock bands, kids today are still wearing them. And it almost seems like hair metal and heavy metal to some degree is a parenthesis in the music lineup. It's almost like we're going through this music and we get to this parenthesis of hair metal, and now that parenthesis is over and we're continuing on. Well, hey, that's it for me. I was long-winded on this. I could talk about this for a long time, as you know. I'm going to be talking about other things for a while, especially when we get guests on the show. But thanks. If you like what I had to say, or even if you hated what I have to say, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And please do me a favor. Please share this on your favorite social media. I'd really like to see this show go viral. I'm Ian C., and we will talk to you again on our next episode of Cereal for Dinner podcast.